Despite public claims of innocence and repeated assurances from Kenneth Copeland's legal team, the pressure continued to build. Federal prosecutors constructed a powerful case, accusing Copeland of exploiting his ministry as a personal treasure, channeling millions of untaxed donations into a lifestyle of astonishing luxury, one that even few televangelists had dared to live so brazenly. The courtroom quickly became a stage for explosive revelations. Investigators presented 2 decades' worth of financial records, painstakingly gathered after years of tracking a complicated network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and property dealings, all meticulously designed to conceal the real flow of funds. One by one, witnesses took the stand. Some were former employees, visibly burdened by years of silence and complicity. Others were expert financial analysts brought in by the prosecution. They exposed how donation money had funded not only private jets but entire airport hangars, a fleet of luxury cars, yachts, and exclusive real estate in the Bahamas, Switzerland, and Aspen. The lavishness stunned even those who had followed Copeland's career closely. It emerged that many of these properties, publicly promoted as sites for ministry retreats or missions, had in reality never hosted a single spiritual event. Instead, they served as private getaways for Copeland and his closest associates. Throughout the trial, Kenneth Copeland remained mostly composed, his hands folded in prayer or gripping the table. The once commanding televangelist, known for his powerful stage presence, now appeared worn down under intense scrutiny. Cameras occasionally captured him weeping quietly as old allies turned against him. Still, he never admitted guilt. In a rare courtroom statement, Copeland addressed the gallery and declared, "I have walked with the Lord all my life. If I am being judged for blessings, then let it be known, my blessings came from God." His words, while emotional, could not erase the mounting evidence. The defense argued passionately that Copeland's financial behavior was typical of other megachurch leaders. They insisted his earnings were legitimate, and any inconsistencies stemmed from accounting errors, not fraud. But the jury was unmoved. The prosecution delivered overwhelming proof: over $150 million missing, millions routed through offshore havens in Belize and Panama, forged invoices, doctored budgets, and a circle of trusted insiders who were generously paid to hide the truth. When the verdict was delivered guilty on all charges, the courtroom fell silent. Copeland lowered his head. Behind him, his wife Gloria sobbed. Their children sat in disbelief. Days later, the sentence was announced: life imprisonment with no chance of parole. Historic punishment for a religious leader in the U.S. The judge condemned Copeland's actions as an outrageous abuse of spiritual authority and labeled the case one of the worst violations of religious trust in American history. The televangelism world was shaken to its core. Leaders across the movement rushed to issue public responses. Some distanced themselves. Others expressed sadness while calling for transparency. Figures like Joel Osteen and Paula White, who had once shared platforms with Copeland, issued careful statements. "This isn't the end of faith," Osteen said during a televised service, "but it is a reminder that no one is above accountability." Critics of the prosperity gospel seized on the verdict, pointing to it as proof that the doctrine equating wealth with divine favor was not only flawed, it was dangerous. Back at Kenneth Copeland Ministries in Newark, Texas, the collapse was swift. Offices shuttered, programs halted, and the once glorious auditorium stood silent. Followers who had sent millions in donations were now demanding refunds and answers. Gloria Copeland, heartbroken but loyal, tried to keep the remnants of their ministry afloat. In a recorded message, she asked for prayers and remained hopeful that God would eventually clear their names. But as donors vanished and staff walked out, the ministry's downfall was undeniable. Even close associates began to break ranks. Marcus Dean, a longtime senior pastor, appeared on television and confessed to helping shift funds between accounts. "I was afraid," he said, "afraid to speak up, afraid to lose everything. But I now see how deep this deception ran. I pray for those we hurt." His admission sent fresh shockwaves through the evangelical world, further unraveling Copeland's image. One video captured during sentencing went viral. Filmed on a phone inside the courtroom, it showed Copeland clutching his Bible, his face crumbling with emotion as he repeated, "This isn't justice." Tears streamed down his face. The clip quickly dominated social media under hashtags like #CopelandVerdict and #ProsperityDownfall. Many expressed outrage or long-held resentment, recounting their own losses after giving in faith to Copeland's ministry. The emotional fallout spread to his family. His daughter, Terry Pearson's once groomed to take over, disappeared from public view and was later reported hospitalized from stress. His son, John, entangled in ministry finances, was hit with a civil lawsuit by former donors alleging fraud. Gloria remained by Kenneth's side but was largely confined to their only remaining property not seized by federal agents. In prison, Copeland was placed under protective custody due to the high-profile nature of his case. His reality was now far removed from jets and mansions, no longer preaching 2000s, he quietly attended prison chapel services, his presence stirring mixed emotions among inmates. Sources reported he spent long hours in his cell, reading scripture or murmuring to himself, whether preparing appeals, clinging to faith, or lost in regret. No one could say. The wider impact was massive. Politicians renewed discussions about religious tax exemptions. Congressional panels began investigating megachurch finances. States drafted legislation requiring annual audits for ministries with large donations. The era of unchecked spiritual empires seemed to be ending. Class action lawsuits began piling up in courthouses across the nation, filed by devastated former donors who felt deceived and betrayed. Some were elderly individuals who had contributed their pensions. Others were single parents, struggling families, and disabled veterans who had given beyond their means. Each lawsuit echoed a similar narrative. Followers had donated to Kenneth Copeland ministries under the belief that their faith-filled contributions would be multiplied by God, just as Copeland had promised during countless sermons and televised broadcasts. One particularly heart-wrenching story came from a widow named Maria Delgado, who bravely stepped in front of a sea of reporters during a tearful press conference. She clutched a faded photograph of her late husband and a tattered notebook filled with sermon notes she had taken over the years. Maria explained how she had donated her last savings over $12,000, believing that God would reward her sacrifice. "I gave everything I had," she said, her voice cracking. "Pastor Copeland said blessings would pour out. I believed him with all my heart, but I was left with nothing." Her story was not an isolated one. Across social media platforms, prayer groups, and Christian forums, thousands shared similar tales. Some had mortgaged their homes, others had skipped medical treatments, or withheld college funds, all in the hope that their seed offering would bear divine fruit. Yet, even amid disgrace and overwhelming evidence of misconduct, Kenneth Copeland retained a surprising and fervent core of followers. Online communities sprang up almost overnight, many asserting that the legal action against him was part of a broader cultural attack on Christianity. Hashtags like #PrayForCopeland and #FaithUnderFire began trending, and emotional live streams featured believers tearfully defending his character. They posted video clips of his most passionate sermons, his declarations that no force on earth could stop a man truly anointed by God, and held virtual vigils, lighting candles and reading scripture aloud in unison. These were people who had followed him for decades, who believed he had brought them closer to God, and who couldn't reconcile the man they knew with the crimes for which he had been convicted. Still, even within those loyal circles, doubt began to quietly take root. For every post defending Copeland, there was another expressing confusion or spiritual crisis. Some longtime supporters began to question whether they had misunderstood scripture or been misled by someone they once trusted unconditionally. Forum moderators who had once silenced dissent now found themselves unable to ignore the growing tide of disillusionment. Some supporters left entirely, shaken to the core. Kenneth Copeland had once embodied the boldest dreams of modern televangelism. With his booming voice, designer suits, and confident proclamations, he stood before millions as a symbol of divine prosperity. He preached that faith could move mountains, that poverty was a curse, and that wealth was a visible sign of God's blessing. For years, he filled stadiums, reached global audiences via satellite networks, and rubbed shoulders with politicians and celebrities. To his followers, he wasn't just a preacher, he was a prophet, a messenger, and a living testimony of God's favor. But now, that once glorious image had crumbled. Behind cold prison bars, Copeland sat stripped of the power and reputation he had built over a lifetime. No longer surrounded by adoring crowds or broadcast studios, he faced the stark reality of consequence. The empire he had constructed, its glossy magazine covers, global charity arms, and sprawling church campuses lay in ruins. And all that remained was a sobering legacy, not just the downfall of a single man, but a profound warning. It was a warning about how unchecked charisma can seduce the vulnerable, and how blind devotion can turn sincere faith into a vehicle for exploitation. It was a story about trust given too easily, and about systems that allowed one man to live like royalty on the back of sacrificial donations. It forced uncomfortable conversations in church pews and living rooms alike about accountability, transparency, and the human tendency to elevate leaders to godlike status. What made the scandal even more tragic was the erasure of the genuine good Copeland's ministry had once accomplished. In earlier years, Kenneth Copeland Ministries had been deeply involved in disaster relief operations. Their convoys had brought food and medical supplies to hurricane victims. Their outreach had fed the hungry, clothed the poor, and offered spiritual support in prisons where hope was in short supply. For a time, the ministry had been a lifeline for many. It had given purpose to volunteers, shelter to the displaced, and encouragement to the brokenhearted. But now, those bright moments seemed overshadowed, lost in the long, cold shadow of betrayal. The memory of generosity had been swallowed by revelations of greed. The good works were now footnotes in a narrative dominated by deception. And for many former followers, the damage extended beyond finances. It fractured their faith, shook their confidence in religious institutions, and left them searching for meaning in the wreckage. What had started as a movement of hope had ended in devastation. The name Kenneth Copeland, once synonymous with miracles and prosperity, now evoked sorrow, anger, and caution. For millions, the scandal served as a sobering reminder. Faith is sacred, but it must never be blind. In the end, Kenneth Copeland's downfall wasn't just a personal collapse, it was the shattering of an image-on-image perfected over decades and broadcast into millions of homes. And when that image cracked, so did the trust of an entire generation of believers.